This whole Bulldozer Raj thing, in India, it really got me thinking.
Yeah.
We're talking about the government just straight up demolishing people's homes, like as punishment.
Right.
That's just intense to think about.
It is.
So we've got this article from The Hindu.
Okay.
And it's by Gautam Bhatia. He's a lawyer.
Okay.
And it's analyzing this recent Supreme Court ruling on it.
Interesting.
And yeah, it gets into some heavy stuff about, the rule of law and what happens when things get blurred.
Yeah, the lines get blurred. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's been going on for a while, this practice.
Oh, really?
Especially in response to protests or any communal tensions, you see it.
Oh, okay.
You see authorities, often kind of spurred on by politicians, actually bulldozing homes.
Wow.
Often those belonging to specific communities.
So it's very targeted.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions about that, the targeting of certain groups.
Yeah.
And whether, whether due process is actually being served.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to create this spectacle of swift justice.
Right, exactly.
The article even mentions
Yeah.
politicians openly celebrating these demolitions.
It's a very visual thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But is that real justice? Or is it
That's the question.
something else entirely?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting, I think, from a legal perspective.
Okay.
Because this practice, it really undermines the concept of due process, right?
Yeah.
Which means everyone has the right to a fair legal process before any action's taken against them.
Right.
Including the right to be heard, the right to present a defense, and it also kind of throws the principle of separation of powers out the window.
Right.
Which is...
Yeah, explain that a little bit.
Yeah, that's the idea that different branches of government have, distinct roles to prevent any one branch from having too much power. But in this case, the government is essentially acting as judge, jury, and demolition crew.
Wow.
All at once.
So they're bypassing all those, checks and balances that are supposed to protect people's rights.
Exactly. And the fact that it took the Supreme Court 3 years to finally issue a ruling against this practice.
3 years is a long time.
Yeah, that's a long time for people to be living under the threat of losing their homes, not knowing if they have any legal recourse, So it really begs the question, is justice truly accessible?
Yeah.
Especially for those who maybe don't have the resources to navigate, a complex legal system.
That's a really, really good point.
3 years is a long time.
It is. And even though the court ruled against this,
right?
What about the people whose homes were already destroyed? What kind of recourse do they have?
That's a huge question. And the article does raise that there's a real lack of clarity about redress and compensation for those past actions.
Right.
It's a huge question mark that needs addressing.
It's really interesting, too, how the government has tried to justify these demolitions.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, they talk about this instant justice.
Right.
But then when they're in court, they argue that it's about enforcing building codes.
Right.
And going after, illegal structures. Isn't that kind of a double standard?
Absolutely, yeah. And the article kind of subtly criticizes the court for not directly calling out that discrepancy. Because on the surface... it seems like it's about upholding the regulations, but the reality is, as highlighted by the timing and the selective targeting, it seems like something a little more problematic is going on,
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it really makes you question,
right.
Are they really trying to maintain order? Or is there something a little deeper going on here?
Yeah, and what's the long-term impact? Right.
Right.
Losing your home,
it's devastating.
It's devastating on so many levels.
On so many levels, yeah.
What happens to these families? Where did they go?
It's a question that deserves way more attention, I think.
Right.
The human cost of these actions is often kind of overlooked.
Yeah.
In all the legal and political debates.
Right.
We're talking about displacement, economic hardship, the trauma of losing your home and that sense of security.
Right. And the article doesn't really, delve into that, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that's a big gap, I think.
Yeah.
It's crucial to really understand how these demolitions, they just make existing inequalities and vulnerabilities so much worse.
Right.
So we need more research, more reporting
that
really centers the experiences of those who are affected.
Okay, so the Supreme Court finally stepped in.
They did, yeah.
Yeah. And issued this ruling.
Yep.
but was it enough?
Right.
Let's talk about those guidelines, because it seems like they're trying to make it a lot harder for officials to just show up and demolish someone's home.
Right, exactly.
On a whim.
Yeah, these guidelines are a big deal.
Okay.
They introduce these, like, more stringent requirements, I guess you could say, for authorities before they can even consider a demolition.
So give me an example.
Yeah, so, like, for instance, mandatory notices have to be served to the affected parties.
So it's not just a matter of showing up with bulldozers anymore.
Right, exactly.
There's an actual process.
There's a process, yeah.
Okay.
And there's a right to appeal the decision.
Okay.
Which is crucial to ensure that people have access to legal recourse.
Right.
If they feel like they've been unfairly targeted, you know.
Oh, right.
But perhaps the most significant change is this requirement that officials have to actually justify in writing
why demolition is the only option.
Okay.
They have to explain why other solutions, like regularization or maybe partial demolition, wouldn't be feasible.
So that seems like a major shift, right?
It is, yeah.
It forces them to, like, actually think it through and consider alternatives.
Exactly, yeah. And it kind of introduces this concept of personal liability, right?
Right.
So if officials can't, like, provide adequate justification, they could be held accountable for their actions. So it adds this whole new layer of scrutiny, you know.
Deterrence.
Deterrence, yeah, exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like these guidelines could actually change the game. But the article does point out this pretty big loophole.
Right.
These protections don't apply to homes that are built on certain types of public land.
Certain types, yeah.
And guess who often lives on that land?
Yeah, you guessed it. The most vulnerable communities and slums.
Right. Which raises concerns about, you know, the effectiveness and the fairness of the ruling.
Right.
Is it truly safeguarding everyone's rights?
Yeah.
Or does it create, you know, this two-tiered system of justice?
So even with these guidelines in place, there are still people who are, like...
We are left out.
Left vulnerable.
Exactly. And it highlights a really important point.
Okay.
Legal victories. They're important, but they don't always translate to real change on the ground, you know?
Right.
So there's still this need for constant vigilance, advocacy, and community mobilization to make sure that these guidelines are implemented effectively and that everyone's rights are actually protected.
This all feels very reminiscent of what we were talking about earlier about the, like, delay in the court ruling. Like, the court can issue guidelines, but if there's no, like, follow-up, enforcement.
It's just words.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's just words on
words on paper. Exactly.
It makes you think about the power dynamics at play here. You have these marginalized communities who are already struggling.
Right.
And then you have the state, like, wielding its power in such a
destructive way.
And
it's a reminder of how easily power can be abused.
Right.
Especially when those in power aren't held accountable.
Exactly. And it makes it even more important, right, to have that strong legal framework, those institutions that can protect the rights of the most vulnerable, especially when they're up against powerful forces like that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really crucial.
The article also mentioned that, like, the court's language in this ruling was a little indirect. Like, they talked about hypothetical situations instead of directly addressing the actual cases of, like, Bulldozer Raj that have happened.
Right.
Why do you think they took that approach?
It's an interesting question. I think maybe they were trying to avoid a direct confrontation with the government, perhaps.
Okay.
Maybe they felt that by laying out these, like, general principles and guidelines, they could kind of steer the government in the right direction without explicitly condemning past actions. Or, you know, maybe they were trying to establish a broader legal framework that could be applied to a whole range of situations beyond just Bulldozer Raj.
Okay, so it was maybe a way of being more, like, universal?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
But by not explicitly calling out these injustices, does that weaken the message at all?
It's a valid concern, yeah. I mean, sometimes a more direct and forceful condemnation is necessary, you know, to send a clear message that, like, certain actions are unacceptable. But there's also a risk of backlash or resistance if the court is perceived as, like, overstepping its bounds or interfering with the executive branch.
So it's this delicate balance
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Right. You want the court to be strong, assertive in protecting people's rights.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to create this whole other...
Right, this political crisis.
Political crisis, exactly. And it raises the question...
With that?
Like, what's the most effective way to bring about change? Is it through these incremental legal victories or through more radical and disruptive forms of resistance?
It's a question we all have to grapple with, right?
I think so, yeah.
Both as individuals and as a society.
As a society, yeah, for sure.
The article calls this whole Bulldozer Raj situation a menace.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's hard to disagree with that.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree.
But it also points to these guidelines, right? Is this like glimmer of hope?
Yeah.
So do you think they have the potential?
I think they have the potential, yes.
Okay.
But as we've discussed, you know, it's not just about having the right laws or rulings on paper.
The key is going to be in how these guidelines are implemented and enforced.
Okay.
You know, will courts across India actually hold officials accountable when they violate these guidelines?
Right.
Will communities have the resources and the support to challenge unfair demolitions?
Right.
You know, those are the questions that are going to determine whether this ruling really translates to meaningful change.
So it's a wait-and-see situation?
Kind of, yeah. This ruling is just one chapter in a much longer story.
Right.
The fight for a just and equitable society in India and really everywhere. You know, it's ongoing, and it requires constant vigilance, engagement, and this, this willingness to hold those in power accountable.
This brings up another point the article touched upon.
Okay.
It mentioned how the Supreme Court has issued guidelines in the past for other issues like hate speech and extrajudicial killings. But those guidelines haven't always been effective.
Why do you think that is?
I think it often comes down to a lack of like follow-up and enforcement. The court can issue guidelines, but if they don't actively monitor the situation and make sure that they're being implemented, they just become like toothless, you know? It's like having a law in the books that nobody enforces.
So it's not enough to have like good intentions.
Right.
Or even like strong legal pronouncement.
Exactly.
It's about making sure that those words are actually translated into
action. Yeah, exactly.
And that requires a multi-pronged approach. Right.
I think so, yeah.
It requires the courts to be proactive in holding the government accountable.
Yes.
It requires civil society organizations to monitor the situation, advocate for those who are affected.
Right.
And it requires ordinary citizens to be aware of their rights. And to speak out against injustice.
Speak out, exactly. So it sounds like a collective effort is needed.
Absolutely,
to really make a difference.
Justice isn't something that's just handed down from above. It's something that we have to fight for and demand.
Right.
Both individually and collectively.
This conversation is really making me think about how, like, even seemingly distant events like this can shed light on these, like, universal struggles for justice and equality.
Everywhere.
It's a reminder that these fights are happening everywhere.
They are.
And that we all have a role to play in demanding better from our leaders and holding them accountable.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, it makes me think about the role of the media in all this.
Yeah.
Because the article mentioned how some politicians were, like, almost celebrating these demolitions.
Right.
Like, using them as a kind of political theater.
It's very visual, yeah.
Right. And it seems like media coverage could either amplify that kind of dangerous rhetoric or help expose it. Yeah.
For what it is.
Absolutely.
So what if they did the opposite?
Right.
What if they really dug deeper, investigated the motivations, and like gave a voice to the people who are being impacted?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
could that help shift the narrative?
I think so. I think investigative journalism, in-depth reporting that goes beyond the surface, amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized.
Right.
I think those can be incredibly powerful tools.
Yeah.
For challenging injustice.
So it's not just about reporting the news. It's about how you report it.
Exactly. Yeah. The framing, the context.
The voices you choose to highlight.
My voices. Right. All of that matters.
All of that matters. Yeah.
It matters immensely.
This whole conversation has been like a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that, like, even something like Bulldozer Raj, which might seem like this distant problem, actually raises these, like, universal question about power, justice. Yeah.
What happens when the rule of law is
eroded?
Eroded.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that these principles, like the right to due process, right to a fair hearing, protection from arbitrary state action.
Right.
These aren't just like abstract legal concepts. They impact real people's lives.
Did you?
In really profound ways.
And it's not just happening in India, right?
Yeah, not at all.
These struggles for justice and equality are happening all around the world.
Everywhere.
Even in our own communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like, what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Yeah.
How can we take these insights and, like, turn them into something meaningful?
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
Educate yourself about the issues, even those that seem far away.
Okay.
Because what might seem like a distant problem today could very well become a reality closer to home tomorrow.
And then what?
Like, what can we actually do?
What can we do? Well, I mean, support organizations that are fighting for justice and equality.
Okay.
Hold your elected officials accountable. And most importantly, don't be afraid to speak up.
Right.
Use your voice to challenge injustice and demand better from those in power.
This deep dive has really driven home the point that we can't just sit back and hope for a better world. We have to be, like, active participants.
We have to be active participants.
In creating it.
In creating it, yeah.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, it has.
It's made me realize that even when we're talking about something as specific as Bulldozer Raj, we're actually grappling with these universal human rights issues that connect us all.
They do. They really do.
And it's a reminder that these struggles are ongoing.
Yeah.
And that we all have a responsibility to be engaged.
To be engaged, yeah.
Informed and active in the pursuit of justice.
In the pursuit of justice, yeah.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Absolutely.